एवरीवन, वेलकम टू माय यूट्यूब चैनल द सोलफुल डायरी। आज के वीडियो में हम बात करेंगे पोस्ट स्ट्रक्चरलिज्म एंड डिकंस्ट्रक्शन के बारे में। चलिए शुरू करते हैं आज की वीडियो। Some theoretical differences between structuralism and post-structuralism. Is post-structuralism a continuation and development of structuralism or a form of rebellion against it? In one important sense, it is the latter, since a very effective way of rebelling is to accuse your predecessors of not having the courage of their convictions. Thus, post-structuralists accuse structuralists of not following through the implications of the views about language on which their intellectual system is based. As we saw, one of structuralism's characteristic view is the notion that language doesn't just reflect or record the world, rather it shapes it so that how we see is what we see. The post-structuralist maintains that the consequences of this belief are that we enter a universe of radical uncertainty, since we have no access to any fixed landmark which is beyond linguistic processing, and hence we have no certain standard by which to measure anything. Without a fixed point of reference against which to measure movement, you cannot tell whether or not you are moving at all. You have probability at some time had the experience of sitting in a stationary to another train between yourself and the far platform. When the train begins to move, you may have the sensation that is your train which is moving, and only realize that it isn't so when the other train has gone and you again see the fixed point of the platform. Post-structuralism says, in effect, that fixed intellectual reference points are permanently removed by properly taking care on board what structuralists said about language. Or to change the analogy in space, where there is no gravity, there is no up and down there, and these pronouncements about language send us into a gravity from universe without upside down or right way up. This situation of being without intellectual reference points in one way of describing what post-structuralists call the decentered universe, one in which, by definition, we cannot know where we are, since all the concepts which previously defined the center and hence also the margins have been deconstructed or undermined in a manner described later. The characteristics concerns of post-structuralism are hinted at here may at first seem pretty remote. Why this constant high anxiety about language, we might ask, when it seems to work perfectly well most of the time for day-to-day purpose? But on reflection, we may find that it is precisely on this matter of anxiety about language that we can most easily identify with post-structuralist concern, for these anxious feelings seem remarkably pervasive whenever we have to use language at any level beyond that of casual daily exchange with people we know very well and whose status is the same as our own. For instance, think of any slightly less straightforward language situation like writing to your bank, writing an essay, striking up a friendship with a stranger at a party, or sending a letter of condolence. In these cases, and many more, is an almost universally felt anxiety that the language will express things we hadn't intended or convey the wrong impression or betray our ignorance, callousness, or confusion. Even when we use a phrase like "if you see what I mean" or in a manners of speaking, there is the same underlying sense that we are not really in control of the linguistic system. These feelings, writ large, are really the same, or at least surely have the same source as the radical linguistic skepticism. This is so typical of deconstruction. Hence, there is a way into post-structuralist frame of mind which lies very much within attitudes and anxieties which most of us experience. However, perhaps it will be very helpful simply to list some differences and distinctions between structuralism and post-structuralism under the four headings below. Origin. Structuralism derives ultimately from linguistics. Linguistics is a discipline which has always been inherently confident about the possibility of establishing objective knowledge, believes that if we observe accurately, collect data systematically, and make logical deductions, then we can reach reliable conclusions about language and the world. Structuralism inherits this confidently scientific outlook. It too believes in mental system and reason as being able to establish reliable truths. By contrast, post-structuralism derives ultimately from philosophy. Philosophy is a discipline which has always tended to emphasize the difficulty of achieving secure knowledge about things. This point of view is encapsulated in Nietzsche's famous remark, "There are no facts, only interpretation." Philosophy is, so to speak, skeptical by nature and usually undercuts and questions conventional notions and assumptions. Its procedures often begin by calling into question what is usually taken for granted as simply the way things are. Post-structuralism inherits this habits of skepticism and intensifies. It regards any confidence in the scientific methods naive and even derives a certain masochistic intellectual pleasures from knowing for certain that we can't know anything for certain, fully conscious of the irony and paradox which doing the entails. Tone and style. Structuralist writing tends towards abstraction and generalization. It aims for a detached scientific coolness of tone. Given its derivation from linguistic science, this is what we should expect. An essay like Roland Barthes' 1966 piece Introduction to the Structural Analysis of Narrative, reprinted in image music text at Stephen Heath 1977, is a typical of this tone and treatment with its discrete steps in an orderly exposition complete within diagrams. The style is neutral and anonymous, as is typical of scientific writing. Post-structuralist writing, by contrast, tends to be much more emotive, often the tone urgent and euphoric, and the style flamboyant and self-consciously showy. Titles may well contain puns and allusions, and often the central line of the argument is based on a pun or a wordplay of some kind. Often, deconstructive writing fixes or some material aspects of language, such as a metaphor used by a writer or the etymology of a word. Overall, it seems to aim for an encourage warm rather than detached coolness. Attitude to language. Structuralists accept that the world is constructed through language, in the sense that we do not have access to reality other than through the linguistic medium. All the same, it decides to live with the fact and continues to use language to think and perceive with. After all, language is an orderly system, not a chaotic one, so realizing dependence upon it need not induce intellectual despair. By contrast, post-structuralism is much more fundamentalist in insisting upon the consequences of the view that in effect reality itself is textual. Post-structuralism develops what the threaten to become terminal anxieties about the possibility of achieving any knowledge through language. The verbal sign in the view is constantly floating free of the concept it is supposed to designate. Thus, the post-structuralist way of speaking about language involves a rather obsessive imagery based on liquid signs, float free of what they designate, meaning are fluid and subject to constant slippage or spillage. This linguistic liquid slopping about and swilling over unpredictably defies our attempts to carry signification carefully from giver to receiver in a container we call words. We are not fully in control of the medium of language, so meaning cannot be planted in set places. Like somebody planting a row of potato seeds, they can only be randomly scattered or disseminated, like the plants walking along and scattering seeds with broad sweeps of the arm so that much of its land unpredictably or drifts in the wind. Likewise, the meanings words have can never be guaranteed or 100% pure. Thus, words are always contaminated by their opposites. You can't define night without reference to day or good without reference to evil, or else they are inferred by their own history so that obsolete senses retain a troublesome and ghostly presence within present day usage are likely to materialize just when we thought it was safe to use them. Thus, a seemingly innocent word like grest is etymologically cognate with hostis, which means an enemy or a stranger, thereby inadvertently manifesting the always potentially unwelcome status of the guest. Likewise, the long dormant metaphorical bases of words are often reactivated by their use in philosophy or literature, and then interfere with the literal sense or with the setting of single meanings. Linguistic anxiety then is a keynote of the post-structuralist outlook. Project by project here, I mean the fundamental aim of each movement, what it is, what they persuade us of. Structuralism firstly questions our way of structuring and categorizing reality and promotes us to break free of habitual modes of perception or categorization, but it believes that we can thereby attain a more reliable use of things. Post structuralism is more fundamental. It distrusts the very notion of reason and the idea of the human being as an independent entity, preferring the notion of the dissolved or constructed subject, thereby what we may think of as the individual is really a product of social and linguistic forces. That is not an essence at all, merely a tissue of textualities. Thus, its touch of skepticism burns away the intellectual ground on which the Western civilization is built. Structuralism, life on a descended planet. Post-structuralism emerged in France in the late 1960s. The two figures most closely associated with this emergence are Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida. Barthes' work around this time began to shift in character and move from a structuralist phase to a post-structuralist phase. The difference can be seen by comparing two different accounts of Barthes of the nature of the narrative, one from each phase, namely in the structural analysis of narrative, first published in 1966 and reprinted in Image Music's text at Stephen Health 19, and The Pleasure of Texting. The former is detailed, methodological, and forbiddingly technical, while the latter is really just a series of random comments on narrative arranged alphabetically, thereby, of course, emphasizing the randomness of the material. Between these two works came the crucial essay, The Death of the Author, 1968, which is in the hinge round which Barthes turns from structuralism to post-structuralism. In that essay, he announces the death of the author, which is the rhetorical way of asserting the independence of the literary text and its immunity to the possibility of being unified or limited by any notion of what the author have intended or crafted into the work. Instead, the essay makes a declaration of radical textual independence. The work is not determined by intention or context, rather, the text is free by its very nature of all such restrictions. Hence, as Barthes says in the essay, the corollary of the death of the author is the birth of the reader. So, the difference between the 1966 essay and the 1973 book is a shift of attention from the text seen as something produced by the author to the text seen as something produced by the author to the text as something produced by the reader and as it were by language itself, or as Barthes also says, in the absence of an author, the claim to decipher a text becomes futile. Hence, the early phase of post-structuralism seems to license and reveal the endless free play of meanings and escape from all forms of textual authority. Later, there is an inevitable shift from this textual permissiveness to the more disciplined and austere textual replicant suggested in the quotation from Bar Johnson. For her, deconstruction is not a hedonistic abandonment of all restraint, but a discipline and identification and dismantling of the sources of textual power. The second key figure in the development of post-structuralism is in the late 1960s is the philosopher Jacques Derrida. Indeed, the starting point of post-structuralism may be taken as his 1966 structure, sign, and play in the discourse of the human sciences. In this paper, Derrida sees in modern times a particular intellectual event which constitutes a radical break from past ways of thought, loosely associated the break with the philosophy of Nietzsche and Heidegger and of psychoanalysis of Freud. The event concerns the descending of our intellectual universe. Prior to this event, the existence of a norm or center in all things was taken for granted. Thus, man, as the Renaissance slogan, had its way to measure of all other things in the universe, while Western norms of dress, behavior, architectural, intellectual outlook, and so on provided a firm center against which deviations, aberrations, variations could be detected and identified as other and marginal. In the 20th century, however, these centers were destroyed or eroded. Sometimes this was caused by historical events such as the way the First World War destroyed the illusion of steady material progress, or the way the Holocaust destroyed the notion of Europe as the source and center of human civilization. Sometimes it happened because of scientific discoveries, such as the way the notion of relativity destroyed the ideas of time and space as fixed and central absolutes, and sometimes finally it was caused by intellectual or artistic revolutions, such as the way modernism in the arts in the first 30 years of the century rejected some center absolutes as harmony in music, chronological sequence in narrative, and the representation of visual world in art. Resulting universe, there are no absolutes or fixed points, so that the universe we live in is decentered or inherently realistic. Instead of movement or deviation from a known center, all we have is a free play, or play as the title of the essay has it. In the lecture, Derrida embraces this just as parties in the death of the Austria celebrates the demise of the authors as ushering in the era of choice freedom. The consequences of this new decentered universe are impossible to predict, but we must endeavor not to be among those who turn their eyes away in the face of the as yet unamiable which is proclaiming itself. This powerful quasi-religious appeal to us not to turn our eyes away from the light is typical of the often apocalyptic tone of post-structuralist writing. If we have the courage, the implication is we will enter this new Nietzschean universe where there are no guaranteed facts, only interpretation, none of which has the stamp of authority upon it, since there is no longer any authoritative center to which to appeal for validation of our interpretation. Derrida's rise to prominence was confirmed by the publication of three books by him in the following year, translated as Speech and Phenomenon of Grammatology and Writing Indifference. All of these books are on philosophical rather than literary topics, but Derrida's method always involves the highly detailed deconstructive reading of literary texts tends to make them emblems of the decentered universe we have been discussing. Texts previously regarded as unified artistic artifacts are shown to be fragmented, self-divided, and centerless. They always turn out to be representative of the monstrous birth predicted at the end of structural sign and play. Critics to read the text against itself so as to expose what might be thought of as the textual subconscious, where meanings are expressed which may be directly contrary to the surface meaning. They fix upon the surface features of the words, similarities in sound, the root meaning of words, a dead or dying metaphor, and bring these to the foreground so that they become crucial to the overall meaning. They seek to show that the text is characterized by disunity rather than unity. They concentrate on a single passage and analyze it so intensively that it becomes impossible to sustain a univocal reading, and the language explodes into multiplicities of meaning. They look for shifts and breaks of various kinds in the text and see these as evidence of what is repressed or glossed over as passed over in silence by the text. These discontinuities are sometimes called fault lines, a geological metaphor referring to the breaks in rock formations which give evidence of previous activity and movement. An example. The three stages of the deconstructive process described here I have called the verbal, the textual, and the linguistic. They are illustrated using Dallas Thomas' poem A Refusal to Mourn, the Death by Fire of a Child in London. The verbal stage is very similar to that of more conventional forms of close reading as pioneered in the 1920s and 1930s in Emerson's Seven Types of Ambiguity and elsewhere. It involves looking in the text for paradoxes and contradictions, or what might be called a purely verbal lead. For instance, the final line of Thomas' poem, "Read after the first death, there is no other." The statement contradicts, refuses itself if something is called a first, then a sequence is implied of second, third, fourth, and so on. So the phrase "the first death" clearly implies at the literal level that there will be others. Internal contradictions of this kind are indicated for the deconstructionist of language, endemic, unreliability, and slipperiness, of which more will be said later. There are other examples of this kind of poem. One other facet of post-structuralism relevant here is its tendency to reverse the polarity of common binary oppositions like male and female, day and night, light and dark, and so on, so that the second term rather than the first is privileged and regarded as the more desirable. Thus, in the poem, it seems to be darkness rather than light which is seen as engendering life, as the poet talks of the mankind making bird, beast, and flower, fathering and all humbling darkness. This paradox reflects the way the world of this poem is simultaneously a recognizable version of the world we live in and an inversion of the world. For the deconstructionist, again, such moments are symptomatic of the way language doesn't reflect or convey our world but constitutes a world of its own, a kind of parallel universe or virtual reality. Identifying contradictory or paradoxical phrases like these then is the first step in going against the grain of the poem, reading it against itself, showing the signifiers at war with the signified, and revealing its repressed unconscious. This first stage will always turn up useful material for us in the later stage. The textual stage of the method moves beyond individual phrases and takes a more overall view of the poem. At the second stage, the critic is looking for shifts or breaks in the continuity of the poem. These shifts reveal inabilities of attitude, hence the lack of a fixed and unified position. They can be of various kinds. They may be shifts or in focus, shift in time or tone, or point of view, or attitude or pace or vocabulary. They may well be indicated in the grammar, for instance, in a shift from first person to third or past tense to present. Thus, they show paradox and contradiction on a larger scale than is the case with the first stage, taking a broad view of the text as a whole. In the case of a refusal to mourn, for instance, there are major time shifts and changes of view in viewpoint, not a smooth chronological progression. Thus, the first two stanzas imagine the passing of geological aeons and the coming of the end of the world. The last light breaks the sea, finally becomes still. The cycle which produces bird, beasts, and flowers come comes to an end as all mumbling darkness descends. But the third stanza is centered on the present, the actual death of the child, the majesty and burning of the child's death. The final stanza takes a broad vista like the first two, but it seems to center on the historical progression of the recorded history of London as witnessed by the unmourning water of the riding Thames. Hence, no single wider context is provided to frame and contextualize the death of the child in a defined perspective, and the shifts in Thomas' poem makes it very difficult to ground his meaning at all. Looking again at the poem to see if you can detect other examples of this larger scale textual level of breaks and discontinuities, note that omissions are important here. That is, when a text doesn't tell us things we should expect to be told. You might begin by asking whether the poet tells us why he refuses to mourn, or rather why the expressed intention of not doing so is not carried out. The linguistic stage finally involves looking for moments in the poem when the adequacy of Language itself, as a medium of communication, is called into question. Such moments occur when, for example, there is implicit or explicit reference to unreliability or untrustworthiness of language. It may involve, for instance, saying that something is unsayable or saying that it is impossible to utter or describe something, and then doing so, or saying that language inflates or deflates or misrepresents its object and then continuing to use it anyway. In a refusal to mourn, for instance, the whole poem does what it says it won't do. The speaker professes his refusal to mourn, but the poem itself constitutes an act of mourning. Then, in the third stanza, the speaker says that he will not murder the mankind of her going with a grave truth. This condemns all the accepted ways of speaking about this event, and the poet professes to stand outside the available range of cliched elegiac stances or discursive practices, as if some pure stands beyond these necessarily comprised forms of utterance were possible. Yet this is followed not by silence but by the seldom quasi liturgical pronouncement of the final stanza. Deep in the first dead lines, London's daughter, the speaker proclaims, which sounds very like traditional panegyrical oratory, with the dead person transformed into some larger than life heroic figure, becoming London's daughter, can impossible designation for her in life, robbed as for some great procession of the dead of all the ages, and now reunited with Mother Earth in the form of the London clay in which she is now buried. You might say Thomas identifies the language trap and then falls into it. Look again at the poem with the textual level in the mind. Are there other examples of Thomas being forced to use the rhetorical strategies that he has just exposed? You might start by looking at his use of the words mother and daughter and thinking about the nature of the metaphorical family implied by these words. Other metaphorical constructs to look at are those entrailed in the word murder and in the notion of unmourning themes. Once the grain of the poem is opened, then it cannot long survive the deconstructive pressures brought to bear upon it and reveal itself as fractured contradictions symptomatic of a cultural and linguistic malaise. A three-step model like this will lend itself to application to other material. It gives this approach something distinctive as a critical practice and lays the strength and weaknesses of deconstruction upon and open to scrutiny just as other methods are open. The deconstructive reading then aims to produce this unity to show that what had looked like unity and coherence actually contained contradictions and conflicts within the text cannot stabilize and contain. We might characterize it as waking up the sleeping dogs of signification and setting them on each other. In contrast, more conventional styles of close reading had the opposite aim. They would like take a text which appeared fragmented and disunified and demonstrate an underlying unity, aiming to separate the waiting dogs and soothe them back to sleep with suitable blandishments. Yet the two methods far apart, though they would see themselves as being suffer from exactly the same drawback, which is that both tend to make all poems seem similar. The close reader detects miracles of voiced ambiguity alike in Johnny's complex metaphysical lyrics and simple poems like Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, which received the full-scale explicatory treatment of the 10 or 20 page article so that the experience of reading them loses all its particularity. Similarly, all the deconstructionist treatment, all poems tend to emerge in angst-ridden, fissured enactments of linguistic and other forms of indeterminacy. I've comment further on some of the characteristics listed on the post-structuralist side using an example, The Castaway, a well-known poem by the 18th century poet William Cowper. As all critics recognize, this poem works at two levels. On the surface, it is an account of the death of man washed overboard from a ship, who speaks in the poem in his own voice and laments his fate. At a deeper level, the poem is about Cooper's own fear of and isolation within his incipient mental breakdown. For deconstructionists, firstly exposing contradiction or paradoxes might involve showing that the feeling professed in the poem can be at odds with those expressed. For instance, in the Casket, the speaker says that he does not blame his shipmates for his plight, but even saying that raises the possibility that he does. Thus, at one point, he says that his friends did all they could to save him, but elsewhere he implies that they desert him and hurry off to save themselves. Secondly, pointing to breaks, gaps, fissures, deconstruct discontinuities in a way of implying that the text lacks unity and consistency of purpose. There may, for instance, be changes in tone or perspective or point of view. In the castaway, for instance, the text sometimes uses I and sometimes he for the man lost overboard, such a destined wretch as I, but his floating home forever led, as I have already indicated at one level. It is an imaginative retelling of the death of a sailor lost overboard during one of his expeditions of the explorer George Anson, based on the account of incident in Anson's published journals. At another level, this is merely a metaphor for the isolation and depression felt by Cooper himself, but the relationship between those two levels is very unsettled, or instead, all the specific details about Anson and his expedition distract from the generalized notion of loss, abandonment, and isolation, and we shift erratically from one to other. Thirdly, the linguistic works which seem relevant include several kinds of linguistic oddity or non sequitur of the kinds which undermine secure meanings. There are many these in the castaway. In the final stanza, the poet says that no divine assistance can when we perished each alone might but the poem has shown the death of only one person. On the other hand, the statement is a general one about how we all have to face death alone, then we should expect the present tense rather than the past. We perished rather than we perished. The term aphoria finally is a popular one. In deconstructive criticism, it literally means an impasse and designates a kind of knot in the text which cannot be unraveled or solved because it is self-contradictory. It perhaps corresponds, therefore, to what the British critic William Empson, in his book Seven Types of Ambiguity 1930, designated as the seventh type of verbal ambiguity 1930. Type of verbal difficulty in literature, namely that which occurs when there is an inconceivable conflict of meaning within the text. For instance, at the start of the third stanza, we are told of the drowned man that no poet wept him, but the existence of the poem we are reading contradicts this. There seems to be no way out of the bird. Bind, it is often said that the Roland Barthes 1968 essay, The Death of the Author, marks the transition from structuralism to post-structuralism, and in that essay, Barthes says that in the text, everything must be disentangled, nothing deciphered. The aphoria true in though is a textual knot which resists disentanglement and several of the elements discussed above as contradictions, paradoxes, or shifts might equally be classified under the moral general heading of aphoria. While it is easy to see why this process might be called reading against the grain, it is misleading to suggest that the poem has an obvious grain or overt meaning, which the critic has merely to routinely counteract. Reading this poem will also have shown, I hope, that structuralist and post structuralist reading practices are much at odds with each other. Identifying patterns and symmetrics in a structuralist manners discovers a unified text which is so to speak happy with itself, whereas reading the text against itself reduces a sense of disunity of a text engaged in a civil war with itself. Reconstruction verbal stage. The verbal stage is very similar to that more conventional forms of close reading. It involves looking in the text for paradoxes and contradictions at what might be called a purely verbal level. The textual stage of the method moves beyond individual phrases and takes a more overall view. At this stage, the critic is looking for shifts or breaks in the continuity. These shifts reveal instabilities of attitude and hence the lack of a fixed and unified position. There can be of various kinds. There may be shifts in focus, shifts in time or tone or point. They may well be indicated in the grammar, for instance, in a shift from first person to third or past tense to present. Thus, they show paradoxes and contradictions on a larger scale than is the case with the first stage, taking a broad view of the text as a whole. The linguistic stage involves looking for moments when the adequacy of language itself as a medium of communication is called into question. Such moments occur when, for example, there is implicit or explicit reference to the unreliability or untrustworthiness of language. It may involve, for instance, saying that something is unsayable or saying that it is impossible to utter it, describe something and then doing so, or saying that language inflates or deflates or misrepresents its object and then continuing to use it anyway. Difference between structuralism and post-structuralism. It is a literary theory. Post-structuralism is just a response to structuralism. Can be related with text and make study of text. The rejection of the self-sufficiency of the structures. System of recurrent patterns or motive closely related to postmodernism. Studied the underlying structure. Argues that study of underlying structure is reason or bias and misinterpretation. Inherent scientific method. Study must be done on base of knowledge, drives from linguistic, rhymes from philosophy. Observe, correlate is oral, collect data system, skeptical by nature, logical deduction, usually undercuts, able to find reliable conclusion, questions notion as an assumption, believes in system, method and reason, inherits habit of skepticism, able to establish reliable truth, fully conscious about the irony and paradox. The Jacques Derrida, born on 15 July 1930, El Ebier, Algeria, died 8 October 2004, Paris, France, French philosopher whose critique of Western philosophy and analysis of the nature of language, writing and meaning were highly controversial yet immensely influential in much of the intellectual world of the 20th century. Derrida is most celebrated as the principal exponent of deconstruction, a term he coined for the critical examination of the fundamental conceptual distinctions or oppositions inherent in Western philosophy since the time of ancient Greeks. These oppositions are characteristically binary and hierarchical, involving a pair of terms in which one member of the pair is assumed to be primary or fundamental, the other secondary or derivative. Ferdinand de Saussure was born on 26 November 1857 in Geneva, Switzerland. He died on 22nd February 1913. Wolfgang Chartier, Swiss linguist whose ideas on structure and language laid the foundation for much of the approach to and progress of the linguistic sciences in the 20th century, Saussure contended a language must be considered as a social phenomenon, a structural system that can be viewed synchronically as it exists at any particular time and diachronically as it changes in the course of time. तो आज की वीडियो आपको पसंद है कैसी लगी हमें कमेंट करके बताएं अगर कोई डाउट्स है सजेशंस है तो वो भी आप कमेंट सेक्शन में ड्रॉप कर सकते हैं अगर वीडियो अच्छी लगी हो तो लाइक शेयर एंड सब्सक्राइब टू माय चैनल मिलते हैं कल एक और इन्फॉर्मेटिव वीडियो के साथ शाम 4 बजे टिल देन कीप वॉचिंग एंड कीप सपोर्टिंग द सोलफुल डायरी थैंक यू